There was once a poor girl from the coal mountains, carrying in her heart the dream of using the law to defend those with no voice. But she soon learned that the talent of someone with no money, no power, and no one to stand behind her was as small and fragile as a candle before a storm. And, at the very moment she was about to fall to the bottom, a hand from the most unlikely of worlds reached out to lift her. The hand of the most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast, a man she never knew had quietly watched over her for 5 years. Before we begin the story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to support us, and we hope you enjoy the story. Ren Sutton grew up among the dying coal mountains of Appalachia, where her father, a miner, died underground with no one to stand up for him, leaving her only a worn pocket constitution and a promise that she would become the defender of those with no voice. With that very mind, she became the valedictorian of her law school, the pride of her poor little town. But all it took was one file slipped into her bag, and one filthy lie, and everything collapsed in a downpour. She was expelled, barred from ever practicing, turned away by the entire legal world. For 5 years after, she lived in the shadows, writing razor-sharp defenses so that others could stand beneath the courtroom lights, shouldering an enormous debt for the man who once swore to protect her, and waking every night to the same hand choking her in a nightmare. The most painful thing was never the false accusation. It was that in all those 5 years, not a single soul had ever asked her, "Does it hurt?" Until the fated night when she was cornered and fled in despair, and a man draped his suit jacket over her shoulders, standing between her and the dark. She didn't know he was Dante Ricci, the don of the most powerful family on the East Coast, a man who could reshape an entire underworld empire with a single word. But was that perfectly timed arrival truly a coincidence? Why would a man of such power reach out to save a girl the whole world deemed worthless? And what would this fated encounter, between a woman who believed in justice and a man who lived beyond the law, set into motion? Her salvation, or a storm far crueler than anything she had ever endured? All of it will be revealed, right after this. The pale light of a New York morning came through the blinds in thin gray lines, and Ren Sutton woke on top of her covers, still wearing yesterday's clothes, her heart already racing before her eyes had fully opened. The phantom pressure of a hand still ghosting at her throat from the nightmare that never seemed to let her go. For a moment she did not know where she was, and then the events of the night before returned in fragments. The fear, the running, the stranger who had stepped between her and the dark. She sat up slowly and saw it draped over the back of her only chair. A suit jacket of charcoal wool, so fine it seemed to drink the light, worth more than every piece of furniture in the cramped apartment combined, and resting on top of it a single card, heavy cream stock, blank except for a phone number embossed in ink so black it looked wet. She picked it up with careful fingers, as though it might dissolve, and turned it over, but there was no name, only that number and, in a hand she did not recognize, 5 words written in the corner. "Get it dry cleaned first." She almost laughed, and then she almost cried, and she did neither, because she had long ago learned that a woman with no money and no name could not afford either luxury for long. Across the river, in a very different kind of room, a man stood at a floor-to-ceiling window, watching the same gray dawn spread over the city he all but owned. Dante Ricci had not slept. He rarely did. Behind him, the door opened without a knock, which was a privilege only one man in the world possessed, and Nico Falcone came in carrying 2 cups of coffee and the loose, easy grin of someone who had known his boss since they were boys, throwing stones off a pier. "You disappear for the whole night," Nico said, setting a cup down on the sill, "and I have to hear from the club that the Don personally escorted some paralegal home like she was made of glass." Dante did not turn. In this city he was a name spoken carefully, the head of a family whose reach ran under the streets and behind the boardrooms. A man who could make a rival vanish from an industry with a single quiet word, and had done so more than once. And yet Nico watched him now with the wary amusement of a man who senses the ground shifting under his feet. "Who is she?" Nico asked, more gently this time. Dante was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, Kika's voice had gone somewhere far away, to a place 5 years gone, that he rarely let himself visit. 5 years ago, he said, the plane went down. His mother and father, both of them, in a single afternoon, and by nightfall the family had turned on itself, like a wounded animal biting at its own flank. Uncles and cousins circling the empire his father had built, his uncle Gio loudest of all, already dividing the territory in his mind before the bodies were even cold. Dante had come home to a war, 29 years old and grieving, and expected to hold together a thing that everyone else was tearing apart, and he had done it, ruthlessly and completely, because there had been no one left to do it for him. But there had been one afternoon in the middle of that storm, he told Nico now, when he had gone to a law school to speak with a professor his family kept on a retainer, and he had walked past a hall where a competition was being held, and a young woman with copper hair and a worn little book in her hand had been standing before a room full of people arguing for a stranger, a nobody, a defendant with no money and no friends, and something in her voice had reached into the wreckage of him and simply held on. He had not known her name that day. He had learned it later. He had learned everything later, and in the years since, while he buried his parents and crushed his enemies and became the man the whole coast feared, he had watched from a distance as the world took that bright, fierce girl and buried her alive, and he had told himself it was not his place to interfere. Nico set down his coffee very slowly. And last night, he said. Last night, Dante answered, still watching the dawn. It became my place. Wren had barely hung the borrowed jacket in a garment bag when her phone buzzed with a message from Sloane Whitmore, 3 words that made her stomach drop. Come in now. And by the time she reached the glass and steel tower where Whitmore and Kessler kept their offices, the whole floor already felt wrong, too quiet, the assistants avoiding her eyes as she passed. Roger Kessler was waiting in the corner conference room, with a lawyer of his own beside him, and a look on his face she recognized from every powerful man who had ever decided a poor woman was a problem to be managed. And before she could even sit, he slid a folder across the table and told her, almost pleasantly, that he intended to file first, that he would say she had followed him to his room, that she had thrown herself at a senior partner, and grown vengeful when he refused her, and that a woman with her record would find no one in this city willing to believe otherwise. Sloane did not defend her. Sloane stood by the window with her arms folded and said, in the soft, coaxing voice she used when she wanted something ugly to sound reasonable, that the smartest thing Wren could do was apologize, quietly, before this became something that touched the firm, and Wren felt the old familiar cold spread through her chest, the understanding that she was once again the most convenient person in the room to sacrifice. She said nothing, because she had learned that silence was the only dignity no one could take from her, and she walked out with the folder still sitting untouched on the table, and it was only in the elevator, alone, watching the numbers fall, that the past came up to meet her the way it always did when she was cornered. She did not have to relive it scene by scene, she only had to remember the 2 faces. She remembered Vanessa Sinclair, the golden daughter of a family that had endowed half the law school, who had smiled at Wren in the library the week before everything ended and asked, with genuine curiosity, how it felt to have clawed her way up from nothing, only to sit beside people who had been given everything, and who had not been able to bear that a girl from the coal country was beating her at the one thing money had always guaranteed her. And she remembered Marcus Thorne, the professor everyone admired, who had called her to his office late one evening with the promise of a recommendation and had made it clear the price of it, and who had turned the whole rotten thing inside out the moment she refused, so that by morning it was Wren who was accused, Wren whose bag had held a sealed client file she had never touched, Wren whose name was passed to the ethics board with a story so neat and so cruel that no one thought to ask who had built it. She had learned only much later that the 2 of them had known each other, that Vanessa's family and Thorne moved in the same narrow world of endowments and favors, and that what had been done to her had not been an accident of bad luck, but a thing designed, quietly, by people who found her ambition offensive. The elevator opened onto the lobby, and Wren stepped out into the marble cold. And for the first time in 5 years, the fear in her did something it had never done before. It turned, slowly, into something harder, because Roger Kessler had just reminded her that the people who destroyed her had never once been made to pay. And somewhere across the city, a man she did not understand had left his coat on her chair, as if to say that this time, she would not be standing alone. He called her that same evening, and the voice on the other end of the line was the one from the alley, low and unhurried, a voice that seemed to assume the world would wait for it, and he asked her a favor that made no sense to her at all, that she come to dinner and sit beside him for a single hour and let a table full of men believe she belonged to him. Ren almost refused, and then he told her the truth of it with a dry amusement she had not expected, that his men had taken to placing wagers on whether the great Dante Ricci was even capable of keeping a woman, that his grandmother had begun sending photographs of eligible daughters from old families, and that a single quiet evening would silence all of it more efficiently than a threat, and something about the plainness of the request, the way he did not dress it up or pretend it was anything other than what it was, made her say yes before she had decided to. A car came for her, long and black and silent, and when she slid into the leather dark of it, and the city began to slide past the tinted glass, she felt, absurdly, like a girl in a story that did not belong to her, and Dante was already inside, dressed in a way that made even his men look ordinary, and he looked at her, for a moment too long before he said only that she cleaned up well, which from him seemed to mean something more than the words. What Ren did not know, and could not have known, was that as the car idled at a red light 2 blocks from the restaurant, Cody Brennan was standing on the corner with a friend, and that Cody had lifted his phone and let out a low whistle at the car itself, at the impossible gloss of it, and had said to his friend that a machine like that cost more than most people saw in a lifetime, and that whoever sat behind that glass was somebody who mattered, somebody who would never so much as glance at people like them. He was close enough that if the window had been down she could have touched him, close enough that she saw the old familiar carelessness in his face, the same face that had once promised to protect her, and she understood with a strange calm that he was looking directly at the car that held her, and seeing nothing, that to Cody she was less real than the paint on the door, that in all the years she had emptied herself for him, she had never once been worth the price of the thing he was admiring. Dante saw her go still. He followed her gaze to the young man on the corner, and back to her face, and though she said nothing, he seemed to read the whole ruined history of it in the set of her jaw, and after a moment he said, quietly, that the man out there had the eyes of someone who counted the value of everything, and understood the worth of nothing. The light changed, and the car pulled away, and Cody dwindled to a shape, and then to nothing in the mirror. And Ren realized her hands were trembling in her lap. Not from grief, she thought, but from the sheer strangeness of sitting inside the very thing her old life had taught her she could only ever stand outside of and admire. She turned to the man beside her and asked him why he had really chosen her for this, out of all the polished women who would have wept for the chance. Dante was silent for the length of a heartbeat, watching the lights pour over her face, before he said that the polished ones had never had to fight for anything. It showed that a person who had been underestimated her whole life knew how to sit in a room full of dangerous men without flinching, and that he had needed someone who would not perform, only endure, and Ren almost smiled at that because it was, she thought, the first accurate thing anyone in this city had ever said about her, and for 1 hour, under a chandelier and the appraising eyes of men who would have crushed her without a second thought, she let herself be treated, for the very first time, as though she were something rare. The peace of that evening lasted exactly until the following afternoon, when 2 men she had never seen before were waiting outside her building, leaning against the brick with the patient stillness of people who were used to being waited for, and one of them said her name as a fact rather than a question, and told her that Cody Brennan owed a great deal of money to people who did not forgive debts, that Cody had run in the night and left no forwarding address, and that when a man vanished, the people he left behind became responsible for what he owed. The number they said aloud was so large it did not feel like money at all. $690,000. a figure Cody had apparently been building in the dark for years while she paid what she thought were his medical bills, and Ren stood on the sidewalk with her key still in her hand and felt the ground tilt beneath her, because she understood at once that these were not the kind of men who threatened idly, and not the kind who could be reasoned with. The younger of the two smiled at her almost kindly and said that they knew all about her, that they knew she had grown up in the coal country, that they knew her father was gone, that they knew there was a mother still living alone up in those hills, and he let the sentence trail off in a way that was far worse than any shouted threat. And then he told her they would give her a little time to be sensible before they started making calls to people who might help her find the money, and the two of them walked away without hurry, leaving her shaking on the steps. She did not remember climbing the stairs. She sat on the edge of her bed with her phone in both hands, and before she could stop herself, she was calling home. Calling the one number that had never once failed to answer. And when Loretta Sutton's voice came down the line warm and unhurried, the whole city seemed to fall away. Her mother was in the middle of packing a box, she said. She had put in a jar of the wild honey from the Hendersons' hives, and some of the green beans she had put up in the fall, and a few of the good potatoes, because a girl working as hard as Wren, in a place as expensive as the city, surely was not eating right. And she talked about the weather turning, and the church supper, and the neighbor's new grandbaby, and Wren sat there in the dark of her tiny room, and let the sound of it wash over her like something she had almost forgotten was possible. A voice that wanted nothing from her, that asked for nothing, that only loved her. Then Loretta paused and asked, in the gentle, careful way of a mother who could hear more than her daughter said, whether everything up there was truly all right, whether the people at her work were treating her decently, whether that young man was being good to her. And Wren closed her eyes and pressed her free hand flat against her chest, and told the kindest lie she had ever told, that yes, everything was fine, that her colleagues were good to her, that she was safe and well, and that her mother must not worry about her at all. Loretta said she was proud of her, that she had always known her girl would make something of herself, that her father would have been proud too, and at the mention of her father Wren had to hold the phone away from her mouth, so that her mother would not hear the breath catch in her throat. She said she loved her. She said she would call again soon. And when the line went quiet, she sat for a long time in the dark, holding the silence like a wound, because she knew now that the men downstairs had already found the thread that led to the one person in the world she could not bear to see hurt, and that no amount of endurance, no amount of silence, no amount of the stubborn pride that had carried her this far was going to be enough to protect her mother from the shape of the storm that was coming for them both. She found him through an old friend of his, who owed her a favor, and did not know better than to give up the name of the pier, where Cody sometimes slept when he was hiding from people, and she went there that same night, because she could not bear to wait. After all, somewhere in the frantic hours since the men had left, she had begun pulling at the threads of her own life, and finding that every one of them came apart in her hands. The pharmacy that had supposedly filled his prescriptions for 5 years had no record of him. The specialist he claimed to see had never heard his name. The condition that had kept him too fragile to work, too broken to help her carry any of it, the condition she had emptied every paycheck to treat, had never existed at all, and the money she had believed was buying him another month of life had been feeding a habit that grew in the dark, while she starved herself thin to feed it. She walked out to the end of the pier, where he stood smoking with his collar turned up against the wind off the water, and when he saw her, his face flickered through surprise and calculation, and finally landed on a kind of tired contempt, and she asked him, very quietly, whether any of it had ever been real. He did not even bother to deny it. He laughed instead, a short, ugly sound, and told her she had always been so easy to use because she needed so badly to be needed, that a girl who had been thrown away by the whole world would forgive anything from the one person who stayed, and that he had simply given her something to stay for. When she said his name in disbelief, he turned on her with real cruelty, and said the thing she had feared for 5 years without ever letting herself hear it aloud, that after everything her name had been dragged through, after the disgrace and the ruin and the whispers, there was not another man alive who would want her, that she should be grateful he had touched her at all, that people like her did not get to be choosy about who did the using. The words landed exactly where he had aimed them, in the oldest wound she had, and she felt herself begin to fold inward the way she always had, and then a voice came out of the dark behind her, calm and almost gentle, and said that the young man seemed to have made a serious error of accounting. Dante Ricci stepped into the light at the end of the pier with Nico a pace behind him, and though he had not raised his voice at all, the whole shape of the night seemed to bend toward him, and the men Cody owed money to, who had appeared from the shadows expecting to collect, went very still when they understood whose ground they were standing on. Ren never saw exactly what passed between them, only that Dante spoke a few low words to the two collectors, and that whatever he said drained the color from their faces and sent them backing away with their palms open, the debt evaporating into the night as though it had never been, because a man who feared the Ricci name did not press a claim the Don had taken an interest in. Then Dante turned to Cody, who had gone from cruel to frightened in the space of a minute, and he looked at him the way a man looks at something he has scraped off his shoe, and he said, without heat, that Cody had held a rare and precious thing in his hands, and had been too small to know it. And then he said the words that Ren would carry with her for the rest of her life, that the thing this fool had treated as garbage was a treasure he himself would have given everything he owned to hold. He did not touch him. He did not need to. He simply told Cody to be gone from the city by morning, and to understand that if her mother's phone ever rang again, there would be no corner of this country far enough, and Cody went, stumbling backward and then running, and the pier was quiet again except for the water. Ren stood there with the wind pulling at her hair and looked up, for the first time, directly into the eyes of the man who kept appearing at the edge of her ruin, and she did not know yet who he was, but she understood that whatever he was, he had just called her a treasure, while the man she had bled for called her trash, and something in her that had been closed for 5 years opened a fraction of an inch. 2 days later, Ren arrived at the firm to find the whole floor rearranged by an invisible hand, the partners subdued, Roger Kessler's corner office dark and stripped of its nameplate, and the reason moving through the halls in fearful whispers that Whitmore and Kessler had been quietly bought overnight by a new controlling interest no one could name, and that the threatened lawsuit against her had been withdrawn before it was ever filed. The whole apparatus that had been built to crush her simply dismantled between one evening and the next. She understood, standing in the sudden strange safety of it, that only one person could have done such a thing, and when the message came asking her to meet him, she went. He received her in a room high above the city, with the lights of it spread out below like a field of embers, and he did not waste words. He told her plainly who he was, the name and the family, and the world that came with it, and he watched her face as she absorbed it, waiting for the fear he was used to seeing, and when it did not come, he seemed almost puzzled by her. He told her he could give her back everything that had been taken, that he could open the doors that had been shut in her face, that he could be the thing she had never had, a floor beneath her feet, and he said it the way he seemed to say everything, as a fact rather than a plea. Let me be the step you climb on. Stand on my shoulders. Take back what is yours. And Ren, who had wanted exactly this for 5 years, found herself hesitating, because she had spent her whole life believing in a thing he lived entirely outside of, and she told him so, that she believed in the law, in the slow, clean machinery of proof and argument, and that he was a man who moved the world by breaking it, and that she did not know how to take the hand of someone like him without becoming something she had promised her father she would never be. He did not argue. He simply asked her a question no one in 5 years had thought to ask. Not the board that had condemned her, not the men who had used her, not even the mother she could not bear to burden, and the question was not whether she had done it, whether she was guilty, whether she deserved any of it. He asked her, quietly, whether it hurt. And something in Ren that had held for 5 years finally gave way, and she found herself telling him about her father, about the mine and the dark, and the men in suits who had made sure no one was ever held to account when the earth came down on him, about the small worn book he had carried in his breast pocket every day of his working life, a cheap pocket constitution he had bought for $1 from a folding table outside a courthouse, a book already half out of date, its pages full of law that the years had quietly overruled, and about how he had kept it anyway, right against his heart, because he believed there were things in it that no amount of time could ever repeal, and about the promise she had made over his grave, that she would become the one who stood up for people like him when no one else would. She told him she still carried it, that it was in her bag at that very moment, useless and precious, and that she did not know how to want justice his way. And Dante listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she was done he said only that he would give her the field, level and fair, but that the final blow would be hers to strike, in the light, by the rules she believed in, and that he would never ask her to become anything other than exactly what she was. And so she agreed. And that same night, in a quiet room with an old judge who owed the family a lifetime of favors and asked no questions, with Nico as the only witness, and the city glittering cold beyond the glass, Wren Sutton married a man she had known for less than a week. Not for love, she told herself, and not for safety, but because for the first time since her father died, someone had looked at the full ruin of her, and called it a treasure, and had promised to hand her back the weapon she needed to save herself. The reckoning with Sloane Whitmore came on a Monday, in the firm's largest conference room, with the new ownership's representatives seated quietly along one wall, and every associate and partner summoned to hear what was billed as a routine transition meeting, and Sloane arrived in her most expensive suit with the serene confidence of a woman who assumed the change at the top could only elevate her further. She did not understand what was happening even as Wren rose and began to speak, calmly, laying a thick folder on the long table and opening it to the first of many documents, and she did not understand until Wren began to read aloud the dates. Every one of the celebrated victories that had built Sloane's name over the past 5 years, the appellate brief that legal journals had called a masterpiece, the defense strategy that had saved a client everyone had written off, the argument that had made her a rising star, invited onto television panels to speak about justice, had been drafted in the small hours by the disgraced woman she paid a fraction of a real salary to work in the shadows. And Wren had kept everything, the original files with their timestamps, the handwritten margin notes in her own hand, the email threads in which Sloane had asked her to explain her own reasoning back to her because she could not follow it, and she laid it all out with the unhurried precision of someone who had waited 5 years to be believed. Sloane's face went through the same sequence Wren had watched on so many faces now, disbelief and then calculation, and then the dawning understanding that there was no story clever enough to talk her way out of a paper trail, and she tried anyway, her voice climbing, calling it collaboration, calling it mentorship, calling Wren ungrateful, until one of the partners quietly asked her to stop, because the room had already seen enough to know exactly what she was. By the end of the hour, Sloane Whitmore had been stripped of every case she had claimed, and escorted from the building she had ruled that morning, and the whispers that followed her out were the same ones that had once followed Wren, and Wren felt no triumph in it, only the strange hollow quiet of a wound finally being cleaned. But the folder had never really been about Sloane, and Dante had understood that from the beginning, because the woman who took credit was only a symptom and not the disease. That evening he brought Wren to a firm the Ricci family had kept on retainer for 2 generations, a firm of severe and brilliant attorneys who owed their loyalty to no one else, and they laid before her the thing she had never once let herself believe was possible, a path back. The ethics ruling that had ended her, the finding that had barred her from ever sitting for the bar, had been built entirely on the sealed client file found in her bag and on the sworn account of Marcus Thorne, and both of those, they explained, could be challenged if there was new evidence that the record had been tampered with, if a motion could be filed to reopen the original proceeding on the grounds of fraud upon the tribunal. It would not be easy. It would mean going back into the very room that had destroyed her and proving, with facts and not feelings, that the case against her had been manufactured, and it would mean doing it in the open, on the record, where the people who had built the lie could see her coming. Wren sat with the papers in her lap, and felt her father's small book pressing against her ribs through the fabric of her bag, and she understood that this was the line Dante had promised her, the field made level, but the final blow left in her own hands, and that everything he had done, the firm bought, the debt erased, the enemies unbalanced, had only ever been meant to bring her to this table with a fighting chance and let her finish it herself, the right way, and for the first time in 5 years, she picked up a pen not to write someone else's defense, but her own. In the days that followed, the firm could speak of almost nothing else, and the story grew in the telling the way such stories do, that some silent buyer had swallowed Whitmore and Kessler whole in a single night, that no name appeared on any document a curious associate could find, that the shares ran up through one shell company into another and vanished into a fog no one could see the far side of, and the younger lawyers traded theories over coffee about which hedge fund or foreign fortune had taken an interest in a mid-tier litigation firm, while the older ones, who had lasted long enough to know when a question was dangerous, said nothing at all and kept their eyes on their own desks. Wren moved through it in a strange double silence, the only person in the building who knew the answer, and the last person who could ever say it aloud, watching people speculate about the very man whose ring she now wore on a chain beneath her blouse where no one could see it. And she found that the secret sat in her chest like a held breath, because to say his name was to unravel everything, and so she let them wonder, and she went home each evening to a world so far above the one they imagined that they would not have believed her if she had told them the truth. And Dante, for his part, had troubles of his own that had nothing to do with the firm, because on the third night after the marriage, his phone rang with the one number he never let go unanswered, and the voice on the other end belonged to his grandmother, Rosa Ricci, the woman the whole family still called Nonna, and still feared, a woman who had buried a husband and a son, and had held the family's oldest secrets longer than most of its enemies had been alive. She did not bother with pleasantries. She told him that word had reached her, as word always did, that her grandson had gone and married a woman no one had heard of, a woman with no family and no name and, she had been given to understand, a shadow over her past. And she told him that she was returning to the city at once, and that she expected to meet this granddaughter of hers, before she decided what was to be done about her, and she said it in the tone of a woman who had never once, in 80 years, failed to get exactly what she demanded. Dante stood at the window a long time after she hung up, looking out at the lights, because he knew his grandmother better than anyone alive, and he knew that whatever storm Wren had already survived, the one now boarding a plane toward her, might prove the hardest of all to weather. In the strange quiet of the days before his grandmother arrived, something unspoken had begun to grow between Dante and the woman who now shared his name, though neither of them would have known what to call it yet. They kept different hours, she rising before dawn out of a lifetime's habit, and he sleeping little out of a different one, and they met most often in the gray light of the kitchen, where she made coffee the plain, strong way her mother had taught her, and he watched her do it, as though it were a thing worth studying. He was a man accustomed to being feared, to reading a room by the way people arranged themselves around his stillness, and he found himself unmoored by a woman who did not flinch when he entered, who set a cup down in front of him without asking, and went back to her reading, who treated the most dangerous man on the coast as though he were simply a person she happened to live beside. For her part, Wren was learning something harder, that a hand could be offered without a price attached to it, that when he asked how her mother was, or whether she had eaten, he was not building toward anything, that the silence he kept was not the cold withholding silence she had known all her life, but something closer to patience, a man holding very still so as not to frighten a thing that had been hurt too many times to trust easily. One evening she fell asleep over her case files at the long table, and she woke hours later to find a blanket over her shoulders, and the lamp turned low and the papers squared into a neat stack she had not left, and he was gone to his own rooms without a word, and she sat in the dim light, with the blanket around her, and understood that she was in far greater danger than any of his enemies had ever put her in, because for the first time in 5 years, she had begun to feel safe, and safety, she knew, was the most expensive thing a woman like her could ever let herself want. Rosa Ricci received her in the great house upstate 2 days later, in a sitting room full of old portraits and older silences, and she looked Wren over from her worn shoes to her carefully composed face, with the frank, assessing gaze of a woman who had spent a lifetime deciding who was worthy of what, and she did not offer tea. She came to the point the way the very old and the very powerful often do, without cruelty and without mercy, laying a slim leather folder on the table between them, and opening it to reveal a single check, signed at the bottom in her own hand, the amount left blank. She told Ren to write in whatever figure she liked, that there was no sum her granddaughter-in-law could imagine that the family could not pay, and that in exchange, she would leave Dante quietly and let him marry someone whose past would not one day surface to shame the name he carried. Ren looked at the blank check for a long moment, and then she looked up at the old woman and said, without heat, that she could not be bought. Not because she did not need the money, God knew she needed it, but because she had spent 5 years being treated as something with a price, and she had promised herself she would die before she agreed to it again. Rosa's eyes narrowed, and something in them shifted, not softening exactly, but recalculating, because she had offered that check to more than one person in her long life, and had never once seen it refused, and she said only that they would see. That pride was a cheap thing when the wolves came, and she rang a small bell to have Ren shown out. It was the housekeeper, an elderly woman who had served the family since Dante was a boy, who undid her without meaning to, walking Ren down the long hall to the door and making the gentle, sympathetic conversation of a servant who has watched too many hopeful young women come and go, and she patted Ren's arm and told her not to take the mistress too hard, that the old woman only worried because the young master had carried a torch for the same girl for 5 long years and had refused every match they put before him, and that surely a wife who resembled her so closely had nothing to fear in the end. Ren stopped walking. She asked, very carefully, what the woman meant, and the housekeeper, realizing too late that she had said something she should not have, tried to wave it away, but the damage was done, and the pieces were already falling into place in Ren's mind with a sick and terrible weight. 5 years. A girl he had loved from a distance and never approached. A wife who resembled her. She stood in the grand, cold hall and felt the ground she had only just begun to trust give way beneath her, because she understood now, or believed she understood, that the man who had called her a treasure on that pier had not been looking at her at all, that she was not the woman he wanted, but only the nearest thing to her that fate had washed up at his feet, a substitute, a stand-in, a living portrait of someone he could not have. Everything he had done, the rescue, the ring, the tenderness she had been foolish enough to begin to lean on, rearranged itself in an instant into something unbearable. The old wound, the deepest one, the belief that no one had ever truly wanted her for herself, opened wider than it ever had, because Cody had used her for money. The world had used her for a scapegoat, but she had let herself hope, just this once, that Dante had wanted her, and now it seemed he had only wanted a shadow, and she was merely the body that happened to cast it. She thanked the housekeeper in a voice that did not sound like her own, and walked out into the gray afternoon, and she did not cry, because she had learned long ago that a woman with no one to catch her could not afford to fall. But the drive back to the city passed in a silence deeper than any she had known, and the small book against her ribs, for once, gave her no comfort at all. For 3 days she kept her distance, and it was in those 3 miserable days that Ren finally understood the shape of what she had been refusing to name. Because a woman does not ache like that over a stranger, does not lie awake rebuilding every conversation, does not feel the particular sick jealousy of imagining him looking at another face, with the tenderness she had let herself believe was hers, unless somewhere in the ruin of everything she had begun to love him, and the cruelty of it was that she had only realized it in the same breath that she had decided it could never be returned. When she finally could not bear the silence any longer, she went to him, meaning to be calm and to ask for the truth plainly, and instead the words came out raw and unguarded. That she knew about the girl from 5 years ago, that she knew she was only a resemblance, a substitute for someone he had really wanted, and that she would rather be released than kept as a living copy of another woman. Dante listened to all of it without moving, and when she had finished he did something she did not expect. He almost smiled, not with mockery, but with a kind of pained tenderness, and he asked her who exactly she imagined this other woman was. When she could not answer, he crossed the room and turned her gently by the shoulders to face the tall mirror on the wall, and he stood behind her so that both of their reflections looked back at them, and he said, very quietly, that the woman he had loved for 5 years was standing right there, that there had never been anyone else, that the girl in the great hall of his memory and the wife in front of him now were the same person, and always had been. Ren stared at their reflection, and could not make the words mean what he was saying, and so he let her go and went to a drawer and took out something small and worn, and he pressed it into her hands, and when she looked down she felt the floor drop away for the second time in 3 days, because it was a card she knew, a small card she had carried in her own notebook for 5 years, without ever knowing who had sent it. It had come with a bouquet on the worst afternoon of her early life, the day the boards had begun, and her whole world had started to come apart. Flowers she had assumed were a mistake, a delivery meant for someone else, because who would send flowers to a girl already being torn to pieces? And she had kept the card only because the single line written on it had been the one kind thing anyone said to her that whole terrible season, and she had read it 1,000 times in the dark years since, without ever learning the name of the hand that wrote it. And now that same hand was in front of her, and Dante told her the truth of that day at last, that he had walked into her law school in the middle of the worst week of his own life, orphaned and hunted and holding a collapsing empire together with his bare hands, and that he had heard her voice in that competition hall, standing up for a stranger with nothing, and that in the wreckage of everything he had lost, her voice had been the one thing that made him believe the world still held anything worth protecting. He had not been able to stay. He had not been able to speak to her. He had only sent the flowers and the card, and then gone back to his war, and he had watched from a distance ever since as her enemies buried her, telling himself again and again that it was not his place, until the night he could no longer bear it, and had stepped out of the dark to catch her at last. Ren looked from the card to his face and back again, and the thing she had believed about herself for her entire life, that she was no one's first choice, that she was only ever the shadow and never the light, simply broke apart in her hands, because the proof was right there in ink 5 years old, that on the very worst day of her ruin, when the whole world had turned away from her, one person had looked at her and seen a treasure, and had been waiting, quietly, ever since. The Bar Association held its annual gala that week in a hotel ballroom full of chandeliers and old money, and Dante insisted they attend together, openly, because he had decided the time for hiding was over, and because he wanted the city to see that the woman they had all buried was standing again. And Ren wore a gown for the first time in her life, and walked in on his arm feeling like an imposter in someone else's story. What neither of them knew was that Loretta Sutton had boarded a bus 2 days earlier with a cardboard box of home things on her lap, unable to shake the worry that had settled in her bones since that phone call, determined to see her daughter's face with her own eyes, and that she arrived at the hotel that very evening in her good church dress, clutching the address Ren had once written for her, stepping into a room so grand and so cold that she stood frozen at its edge, a small work-worn woman among the diamonds. And it was Vanessa Sinclair who saw her first. Vanessa who had risen in these 5 years into exactly the kind of celebrated public figure she had always believed she deserved to be, and who could not bear that the girl she had ruined had somehow crawled out of the grave and married one of the most powerful men on the coast, and she saw her chance in the frightened woman at the door. She did not attack the old wound directly, because she was cleverer than that. Instead, she raised her glass and her voice, and drew the room's attention with a smile like a blade, and she began to speak of how touching it was to see a coal miner's daughter marry so far above her station, how one had to admire the ambition of a girl from a place like that, who had understood so young that a face and a marriage could buy what merit never would, and she gestured toward the small woman trembling at the doorway and asked, to laughter from the cruelest corners of the room, whether that was the mother, whether they had all come down from the hills to see how the other half lived. The laughter spread the way laughter does among people who are relieved it is not aimed at them, and Ren felt the old paralysis grip her. But before she could move, her mother was already crossing the floor. Loretta Sutton walked through that glittering room in her plain dress with her back straight, and she did not raise her voice, and she stood in front of her daughter as if to shield her with her own body, and she said, to the whole staring room, that she did not care what any of them had heard, or what any of them thought they had seen, that she knew only one thing in this world for certain, and that was her own daughter. She told them, in the plain, unhurried speech of the mountains, that her girl had walked 4 ridges before dawn to reach a schoolhouse when she was 6 years old, in summer heat and winter dark, that she had been the first child in the history of that whole hollow to go to a university, that her father had died in the ground carrying a $1 book against his heart, and had made his daughter promise to be the voice for people no one listened to, and that whatever these fine people believed they knew about ambition, and about buying what merit could not, they knew nothing at all about where her daughter had come from, or what it had cost her to survive it. The room had gone silent by the time she finished, the laughter dead in their throats, and Wren was weeping openly now, reaching for her mother, and Loretta turned to take her daughter's hand and smile at her, and it was in that moment, mid-turn, with the words barely finished, and her hand not yet closed around Wren's, that something in her simply gave way. She swayed, and her knees folded, and she went down onto the polished floor before anyone could catch her. And Wren's scream tore through the ballroom as she dropped to the ground beside her, and the last thing Loretta Sutton saw before the dark took her was her daughter's face, and the last thing she managed to do was press her rough hand once, gently, against Wren's cheek. Loretta Sutton lay in a private room in the best hospital in the city, brought there within the hour by a name that made administrators appear from nowhere, and the doctors told Wren in careful words that her mother had suffered a stroke, that she was alive but sleeping somewhere they could not reach, and that whether she would wake at all was a thing no one could promise. Wren did not leave her side. She sat in the hard chair beside the bed through the days and the long nights, holding the rough familiar hand that had packed the box of honey and beans that still sat unopened on the floor of her apartment, and she talked to her mother about everything and nothing, about the mountains and the schoolhouse, and the promise she was so close to keeping now, and she pressed her father's small book into her mother's still fingers, as if the two of them together might reach through the dark and pull her back. Dante came and went silently, arranging everything and asking nothing, and it was in those hours, watching her refuse food, and refuse rest, and refuse every comfort so that she could stay bent over that bed, that another watcher began to change her mind, because Rosa Ricci had come to the hospital meaning only to observe, and had stood unseen in the doorway for a long time, and what she saw was not a schemer or a social climber, but a daughter keeping vigil, the way Rosa herself had once kept vigil over her own dying, and the old woman went home that night saying nothing, but she did not mention the blank check again. While Wren kept her watch, Dante was quietly finishing what she could not, moving through the city to lay the ground for the reopening of her case, and the linchpin of all of it was Marcus Thorne, the professor whose sworn word had built the lie, because if his account could be shown to be false, the whole structure would fall. Nico was given the simple task of watching the man, learning his habits, documenting who he met and where, gathering the small ordinary evidence that patient surveillance yields, and Nico, who was very good at many things, but who had never entirely trusted a photograph over his own eyes, spent the better part of 2 days shadowing a distinguished silver-haired man in an expensive overcoat, following him to a members' club, and a tailor, and a long lunch, assembling a careful dossier, before he brought it to Dante with quiet pride, and Dante looked at the top photograph for exactly 1 second and asked him who on earth that was. It was not Thorne at all. It was some blameless retired banker who happened to share the professor's build and barber shop, and Nico had been trailing the wrong man across half the city while the real Thorne carried on undisturbed on the other side of it. And for a moment, even the grim machinery of the thing paused, while Nico swore softly, and Dante allowed himself the ghost of something that was almost amusement, the first in many days. But the error cost them time they did not have, because the days were running down toward the hearing, And when Nico finally found the right man, he found him nervous and watchful. A man who had begun to sense that the ground beneath his old lie was no longer as solid as he had believed. A man taking calls he did not want overheard, and meeting, once, in a parked car at the edge of a lot, with a woman whose golden hair Nico recognized at once. He photographed that meeting from a distance and brought it back, and this time Dante studied it a long while, because it confirmed what Ren had always insisted and no one had ever believed, that Thorne and Vanessa Sinclair had not been two separate misfortunes, but two hands of the same design, and that they were talking again now, which meant they were frightened, which meant they knew she was coming. Dante set the photograph down and looked out the window toward the hospital where his wife sat, holding a dying woman's hand, and he understood that the board was nearly set, that the enemies had drawn together in their fear exactly as he had known they would, and that all that remained was to bring them all into one room, in the light, and let Ren do the rest. The night before the hearing was the longest of her life. She spent it where she had spent every night for weeks, in the hard chair beside her mother's bed, holding the still hand, and listening to the slow mechanical breath of the machines, and the fear she had held at bay through all her careful preparation finally came for her in the dark. She was afraid, she admitted to the sleeping woman, not of losing, she had lost before and survived it, but of standing in that room and finding that the girl who had once been brave enough to speak for strangers was gone, worn away by 5 years of silence, until nothing was left but the habit of enduring. She was afraid her mother would never open her eyes to see it, afraid the promise she had carried since childhood would be kept in front of the whole country, and yet arrive too late for the two people it had ever truly been for. It was near midnight when Dante found her there, and he did not turn on the light. He only drew a chair close and sat with her in the dark, and when she told him, in a small, unguarded voice, that she did not know if she was strong enough, he did not tell her that she was, because he had learned she distrusted easy comfort. He told her instead that he had heard her be strong once already, 5 years ago, in a hall full of people, when no one was protecting her, and nothing was promised to her, and she had stood up anyway for someone the world had thrown away, and that the woman who had done that had not gone anywhere, she had only been made to wait. He reminded her of the one condition she herself had set, that the final blow would be hers and hers alone, and he told her he would keep that promise even though it cost him everything not to walk into that room and end it for her, because he had come to understand that the greatest gift he could give her was not his power, but his restraint, the room to win it herself. And Ren looked at him across the dark and felt the fear loosen its grip, not vanish, but loosen, and she reached out and took his hand and held it against the rail of her mother's bed, the three of them together in the quiet, and she said that in the morning she would go and finish it. The hearing to reopen her case was held in a state courtroom that permitted cameras, and because the story had by now caught the public's imagination, the ruined valedictorian who had married a shadow and come back to fight for her own name, a legal channel carried it live, so that what happened that morning happened in front of the whole watching country. Ren arrived in a plain dark suit, with a single slim folder, and her father's book in her breast pocket, and she had asked Dante to stay in the gallery, and not at her side, because she had told him she needed the room to see her stand on her own, and he had understood, and taken his seat among the spectators, like any other citizen, and only Ren knew what it cost him to sit still and let her walk to that table alone. On the other side sat the phalanx she had expected, the university's lawyers and the ethics board's counsel and, seated as an interested party because her family's foundation had funded the original inquiry, Vanessa Sinclair herself, radiant and composed, a celebrated public figure now, there ostensibly to defend the integrity of a proceeding she had in fact engineered. From the first minute Vanessa's counsel moved to have the whole thing dismissed, arguing that the petitioner was not even a member of the bar, that she had been lawfully barred years ago, that she had no standing and no license and no business speaking in a court of law at all. And when the judge allowed Ren to respond, it was Vanessa who could not resist leaning forward to twist the knife herself, asking the room, with a pity so elegant it drew a few murmurs of agreement, What exactly a coal miner's daughter with no credentials, no firm behind her, and no right to practice imagined she was going to accomplish by playing lawyer on television? She said that people like Ren mistook a good story for a good case. That sentiment was not evidence. That the petitioner had arrived with a thin folder and a borrowed name and clearly nothing else. And then she made the mistake that the arrogant so often make. She pressed too far, challenging Ren openly to make her argument then and there without her documents, without the machinery of a real firm, without any of the advantages she had married her way into, to see whether there was anything underneath the sad little legend at all. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment it looked exactly like the trap it was. Ren alone at the table with her single folder closed in front of her, the cameras pushing in on a woman the whole world had been taught to see as finished. And even in the gallery, Dante's hand closed slowly into a fist against his knee, because this was the instant everything turned on, the moment she had insisted on facing without him. Ren stood, and she did not open the folder. She let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable, and then she said, quietly enough that the room had to lean in to hear her, that Miss Sinclair was right about one thing, that she had no firm standing behind her, and no license in her pocket, and no pedigree to trade on, and that she had come with almost nothing at all. And then she reached into her breast pocket and drew out the small worn book and set it gently on the bare table in front of her, where the cameras found it at once, a cheap dollar constitution soft with handling and dark at the edges from years against a working man's heart, and she rested one hand flat upon it, and the whole tenor of the room shifted in a way that no one could quite have named, because a woman who had been made to look empty-handed had just laid down the only thing she had ever truly needed, and Vanessa Sinclair, watching her, felt for the first time a thin, cold thread of fear. She left the folder closed, and she left her notes untouched, and she began to speak, not in the polished cadence of the courtroom, but in something plainer and truer, and she told them about the book beneath her hand. She told them it had cost exactly $1, bought from a folding table on a courthouse sidewalk by a man who had never once in his life been able to afford a lawyer, and she told them that half of what was printed in its worn pages was no longer good law at all, that the years had overruled it and amended it and quietly retired whole passages of it, that any first-year student could open it and find a dozen things it got wrong. Her father had known that, she said. He had understood that the book in his pocket was out of date, almost from the day he bought it, and he had carried it against his heart, for 30 years anyway, down into the dark every morning, where not one of the men who profited from his labor would ever follow him, because he believed, and she believed after him, that beneath all the amendments and reversals and the endless churn of what the law happened to say this year, there were a few things written in it that no amount of time could ever repeal, and the first of those was that a human being, however poor, however voiceless, however easily thrown away, was owed someone willing to stand up and speak for him. She said her father had died in that dark with no one to speak for him, that the company had its own row of lawyers and the men who dug the coal had none, and that she had knelt at his grave as a girl and promised him that she would become the voice he never had, for him and for everyone like him, and that this promise, and not ambition, and not vanity, and not the fairy tale marriage that people found so amusing, was the only reason she had clawed her way up out of that hollow to a law school that had never wanted her there. She turned then, and looked directly at the row of lawyers, and at the woman seated behind them, and she said that they had spent the morning trying to measure her by the things she did not have: no pedigree, no firm, no license, no family name that opened doors, and that they had made the same mistake about her that people of their kind had been making her whole life. And she said the words slowly and without a tremor, that she had come from the mountains, from a place they would not deign to drive through, but that she had never once in her life believed herself to be less than any person in any room. The courtroom had gone utterly still. She said that they had called her empty-handed, and that they were right, that she stood before them with a closed folder and a dollar book and nothing else that they would count as worth anything, and that this was precisely the point. Because the law they all wore like a coat of armor had been written, in its best and truest parts, exactly for the person who comes to it empty-handed, the person with no money and no power, and no one behind her, and that if it could not be made to work for someone like that, then it did not deserve the reverence they demanded for it. She said she was not asking the court to reopen her case out of pity, or out of sympathy for a sad story, that she despised pity, and had survived without it for 5 years, but that she was asking because a proceeding built on a lie was an insult to every principle in the small book under her hand, and that she intended, before the day was over, to show them exactly how that lie had been built, and by whom. And when she finished, there was a silence in that room unlike any the cameras had ever recorded, the particular silence of a great many people realizing at once that they had badly misjudged what they were looking at. And in the gallery, Dante Ricci sat very still with his eyes bright, and his fist finally uncurled, because the woman whose voice had reached him across the wreckage of his life 5 years ago had just reached an entire nation, and Vanessa Sinclair, seated behind her lawyers, had gone the color of ash. Only then did she open the folder, and what came out of it was not sentiment, but the slow, patient architecture of proof, built over weeks in the hospital chair, and the long nights before it, and she laid it down piece by piece, so that the room could watch the lie come apart in real time. She began with the sealed client file that had been found in her bag 5 years ago, the single physical fact on which her entire disgrace had rested, and she produced the building's own access records, obtained lawfully through the reopened proceeding, showing that on the evening the file was supposedly stolen, her card had never entered that wing of the building at all, while another card, Marcus Thorne's, had. She produced the original ethics board transcript, and set beside it the professor's later sworn statements, and walked the court through the small contradictions that a careful reader had spent years cataloging, the times that did not line up, the details that had changed between one telling and the next, the account of a private meeting he claimed she had requested that the very records he had signed proved she could not have attended. When the university's lawyers rose to object, she answered them not with passion, but with citation, and the judge, leaning forward now, let her continue. Then she turned to the thread no one had ever pulled, the connection between the professor and the family whose foundation had funded the inquiry, and she introduced, properly authenticated, and entered into the record, the evidence that Thorne and Vanessa Sinclair had been in contact throughout the original case and had met again in recent weeks, and she asked the court a simple question: why 2 people who claimed to have had nothing to do with one another had spent the past month meeting in parked cars, and the question hung in the air like a struck bell. Vanessa Sinclair did not break the way a lesser person would have. She rose without being called, elegant and unhurried, and she turned the full force of a lifetime's confidence on the room, and for a few dangerous minutes she was magnificent in the way that only the truly practiced can be. She called it a coordinated smear, a desperate woman with a powerful new husband buying herself a second chance at a story that had already been decided by a lawful board years ago. She reminded the court and the cameras of exactly what Wren had been, the girl found with a stolen file, the student who had traded on a professor's weakness, and she asked the room to consider which was more likely, that a celebrated public servant from a family of impeccable standing had spent 5 years secretly persecuting a stranger, or that a disgraced opportunist had simply married her way into the means to rewrite her own history. She was good, and Wren felt the room begin to tilt, felt some of the watching faces soften back toward the comfortable old version of the story, and she understood that a lie told with enough poise could still, even now, outrun the truth. But Vanessa had never in her life been made to sit in a chair she could not command, and in her certainty that she was winning, she reached for the flourish, insisting that she had had no contact whatsoever with Marcus Thorne during the original inquiry, and none since, that the very suggestion was beneath the dignity of the proceeding, and she said it with her chin high and her voice ringing. And it was the one thing she should never have said, because Wren had the parking structure's own time-stamped records already entered into evidence, and she laid them down 1 page at a time without a word, and the room watched a woman's certainty curdle into something else entirely as the dates on the paper contradicted, flatly and publicly, the words that had just left her mouth. It was Thorn who broke first, because guilt is heaviest in the ones who were only ever cowards. And when he was called and placed under oath, he tried to hold the old story together, and could not, contradicting on the stand what he had sworn on paper, growing flustered under Wren's quiet, relentless questioning, until he said the one thing that undid them all, blurting that he had only done what he was asked, that it had not been his idea, and in the silence that followed, every eye in the room, and every camera turned toward the woman seated behind the lawyers. Vanessa Sinclair, who had spent 5 years believing herself untouchable, made the final error of trying to speak, of protesting her innocence, before anyone had accused her, and in doing so she named details of the original scheme that only its architect could have known, and the trap she had built for a coal miner's daughter, closed instead around her own throat. The judge did not deliver a verdict that afternoon, because the machinery of the law is slower and cleaner than that, but he did what mattered. He found that the original proceeding had been tainted by fraud upon the tribunal. He vacated the finding that had barred Wren from the profession, and he referred the conduct of Thorn and Sinclair, and by the week's end the connected dealings of Kessler and the credit thief Whitmore, to the authorities for criminal investigation, and he did it all on the record, in the open, before the largest audience a legal broadcast in that state had ever drawn. Wren had won, and she had won the only way she had ever been willing to win, not by the power of the man in the gallery, who had not spoken a single word or lifted a single hand inside that room, but by the slow, clean machinery she had believed in since she was a girl, kneeling at a grave. And as the gavel came down, and the room erupted, and reporters surged toward the rail, she stood alone at the plain table, with her hand resting once more on the small, worn book, and she looked up, past the noise, to find Dante on his feet among the crowd, watching her the way he had watched her 5 years ago, and she understood that she had just kept her promise to her father in front of the entire country, with nothing in her hands but the truth and $1's worth of paper he had left her. The Sinclair family did what powerful families always do when one of their own is caught in the open. They closed ranks and reached for the levers they were used to pulling. Quiet calls to old friends, hints of endowments that might be withdrawn, the machinery of influence that had protected Vanessa her whole life. And for a day or two, it seemed that even a public disgrace might be smoothed over the way so many of their troubles had been smoothed over before. What they had not accounted for was Rosa Ricci, who summoned Wren to the great house the day after the hearing, and who received her this time not in the cold portrait room, but in her own warm study, and who had, in the intervening hours, made a great many calls of her own. The old woman told her, without ceremony, that the Sinclairs had done business with the Ricci family for 2 generations, that their foundation, and their banks, and their good name all rested on relationships that Rosa herself had helped build and could just as easily unmake, and that she had spent the morning quietly informing certain people that the family's patience with the Sinclairs had come to an end, that no favor would be called in on Vanessa's behalf, no door held open, no soft landing arranged, and that the girl would answer to the law like anyone else, alone, exactly as she had left Wren to answer 5 years before. She had done it all through the proper channels, through influence, and not through force, because she had understood, watching that, hearing that this granddaughter of hers cared about such distinctions, in a way the family had long forgotten how to, and she found, to her own surprise, that she respected it. Then Rosa Ricci did something she had done only twice before in her long life. She rose, and she took Wren's hand, and she slipped onto her finger a heavy old ring that Wren recognized at once as the thing the family called its heirloom, the ring passed to the woman each generation judged worthy of holding the family's name, and she said that she had refused to give it while she believed her grandson had married a shadow, and that she had been wrong, and that she was too old to waste what little time she had left pretending otherwise. She held Wren's hand in both of her own, and looked at her with eyes that had buried a husband and a son, and had learned, at last, to recognize strength when it stood in front of her, and she said the mountains the girl came from were only the place where she had begun, and not the place where she would stop, and that any family fortunate enough to have her had better understand the difference. Ren, who had walked into that house weeks ago prepared to be bought and dismissed, stood with the old ring warm on her finger and the old woman's hands around hers, and found that she could not speak at all, because for the second time in a matter of days, someone who had every reason to look down on her had chosen instead to look at her and call her worthy, and the girl who had spent her whole life being told where she belonged had just been told, by the last person she expected, that there was no ceiling above her at all. It was later that evening, in the quiet of the house above the city, that Ren finally asked him the question she had never quite dared to ask: how a mid-tier litigation firm had come to be swallowed overnight by a buyer no one could name, how a threatened lawsuit had simply evaporated, how a woman barred for life had found herself sitting across a table from the most loyal attorneys in the state, with a path back to everything she had lost, and Dante did not pretend not to understand her. He only looked at her for a long moment and then told her the truth she had already half guessed, that the silent buyer the whole firm had spent weeks whispering about was him, that he had bought the ground out from under her enemies not to control her, but to clear the field so that she could win it fairly, and that everything he had done from the first night in the alley had been in service of a single stubborn hope, that the woman the world had buried would one day stand up on her own and be seen. She asked him why, and instead of answering he reached again for that small 5-year-old card, the one that had arrived with a bouquet on the worst afternoon of her young life, and he laid it in her palm beside the notebook where she had pressed, and kept it all these years without ever knowing the sender. And she looked at the flowers she had assumed were a delivery mistake, and the single line of kindness she had read 1,000 times in the dark, and she understood at last that the whole circle had closed, that the hand that wrote that card, and the hand that draped a jacket over her shoulders in the dark, and the hand that had just cleared her name were all the same hand, and that it had been reaching for her, patiently, across 5 silent years. And then he did the last thing she expected. He stepped back and inclined his head with a gravity that was almost shy, and he introduced himself to her as though they had never met, telling her his name was Dante Ricci and that he was very glad to finally know her, the same words he had been too broken and too hunted to say to her on the day he first heard her voice. And Ren laughed through her tears and gave him her own name in return, and it felt less like an ending than like the true beginning they had both been denied. It was in that moment, with the card in her hand and his name in the air between them, that her phone rang, and it was the hospital, and the voice on the line was careful and then warm, telling her that her mother had opened her eyes an hour ago, that she was awake, that she had asked, in a small and hoarse and living voice, for her daughter. Ren was at the hospital within the hour, and when she pushed open the door, her mother was propped against the pillows looking impossibly small and impossibly alive, and the reunion needed no words, only the two of them holding on to one another and weeping the way people weep when they have been given back something they had already begun to grieve. When at last Loretta could speak, she asked the questions a mother asks: whether her girl was eating, whether she was safe, whether the terrible thing at the fine party had been real, or a thing she had dreamed in the long dark, and Ren told her the truth this time, all of it. The hearing and the promise kept, and the name cleared in front of the whole country, and Loretta pressed her rough hand to her daughter's cheek exactly as she had in the ballroom, and said that she had known, she had always known, that her girl would make them listen. It was then that she noticed the man standing quietly at the edge of the room, hat in his hands, waiting to be acknowledged and not presuming a step further. And Ren brought him forward and told her mother plainly who he was and what he had done. Not the empire and the fear, but the jacket in the dark, and the field made level, and the 5 years of silent watching. And Loretta studied him a long moment with the frank measuring look of a mountain woman who had never once in her life been impressed by money. Then she reached out and took his powerful hand in both of her small worn ones, the hands that had packed honey and put up beans and sewn by lamplight, and she thanked him, simply, for standing behind her daughter when the whole world had turned its back, and she told him that where she came from, a man was measured not by what he owned, but by whether he stayed. And that he had stayed, and Dante Ricci, who had faced down enemies that made governments nervous, found that he could not quite meet the eyes of a coal miner's widow in a hospital gown, and he bowed his head and said, very quietly, that it had been his honor. She went home to the mountains that spring, once her mother was strong enough to travel, and had settled back into the small house in the hollow, with the honey jars and the church suppers, and the neighbors who had never once stopped believing in her. And one clear morning, Wren walked up the ridge path alone to the little cemetery where her father lay, with Dante a few paces behind her, saying nothing, only there, the way he had learned she needed him to be. She knelt at the modest stone and she took the small worn book from her breast pocket, the dollar Constitution soft with 30 years of a working man's heartbeat and 5 more of her own, and she rested it for a moment on the top of the stone, not to leave it, never to leave it, only so that he might touch it once more through her. And she told him quietly that the promise was kept, that she had become the voice for people like him, that she had said it out loud in front of the whole country, and no one had been able to bury her this time, and that a great many people who would never have had anyone were going to have her now. Then she picked the book back up and pressed it once against her lips, and slid it home into her pocket over her own heart, and she rose, and she said the last of it softly to the wind moving through the pines, that the little book was still as old and as out of date as the day he left it to her, that it still could not be used to look up a single thing, but that it had walked with her through all of it, and would walk with her through whatever came next, and that she would keep it, always, the way she had always kept him, right here. And if you have made it this far with Wren and with me, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and to like and share this video, so that you never miss the stories we bring you every single day. And please tell us in the comments how this story made you feel, because there is nothing we treasure more than hearing what stirred in your heart as you listened, the moments that made you ache, and the moments that made you hope. We wish every one of you watching good health, a life full of quiet joy, and peace in your days. Until next time, goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the very next video.